Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Where have you gone?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I hope everyone's tuning in and can hear me loud and clearly.
Yeah, and I can see.
Great. So my name's Elle, and I'm the Director of Programming at the Sacred Space Miami, which is a wellness center here. And we're offering digital programming, which is, we're very excited to be doing this with Biohack the World and to have incredible guests here this evening, which I will let David introduce. But before we kick it off, I just wanted to share some housekeeping notes. So if you'll all do get involved in turning your computer on mute, you can do that in the right-hand corner, or sorry, at the lower menu bar on the left-hand side. And then also just turning your video off so we can make, just provide a clear experience for everyone involved and also for the recording. And later on in the talk, there will be a presentation, and you will have the option to minimize the view of all the speakers. So you'll see how to do that. It'll just be on the top of where you see all the speakers, and you'll be able to minimize that and hide that. So if you have any questions while the talk is in progress, you can feel free to use the chat, which is again on the menu bar. And you can just write your question into the chat and I'll be sure to get to it. So with that said, I'm very excited to hand you over to David Choi of Biohack the World. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Elle. So great to be here. So grateful for Sacred Space for providing this opportunity to provide this amazing life-saving information for everyone. So greetings and welcome everyone to another Biohack the World event and our very first online event. So this is the webinar edition. My name is David Choi, and I'm the executive producer and the host of Biohack the World. And if you're new to the show, we've been hosting live biohacking shows in New York City and Miami since 2018, featuring speakers like Dave Asprey, Ben Greenfield, Oz Garcia, and so many more. And since we're now having to move our events online, we're going to just zip right through and get straight to the grass-fed meat and sweet potatoes, or whatever it is that you're eating for dinner these days. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the format. So the first half, we feature we're going to have a presentation by our featured speakers, and then we're going to transition into an interactive Q&A with the audience, you. So please feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat room, and we're going to be fielding your questions there. So we're going to be monitoring the activity. And again, if you're new to Biohack the World, our mission here is to create a cleaner, safer, more equitable, and judicious place for all of us to not only live, grow, and prosper, but to help others do the same through the education of our biology, our microbiology, our psychology, and our environment. And if whatever is going on today, this crisis that's engulfing our nation is any indication, it just goes to show that we're all in this together, that we are not alone in this fight. And we absolutely cannot advance as a society if we're not looking out for ourselves, but also the people around us. A rising tide raises all ships. And if we're going to try to live for forever or 200 or whatever biohackers want to live to, we absolutely have to have that environment and to be able to sustain us to the next century and beyond. And to that end, we have a very exciting show for you today. One that's going to spark that drive in you to live your best life. We're going to give you some key tips and strategies on how to strengthen and fortify your immune system and your constitution, and to prepare you physically, emotionally, and even spiritually for the incredible fight ahead. Because it's going to be a fight, and that's what we do as biohackers. We see an obstacle, and it becomes our way. You know, those health studies that show a healthy population? Well, we are that healthy population. We're a very special subset of that population, biohackers, where we'll actually see the studies and the recommendations, and we'll go into the research and the studies, and we'll discern whether or not that particular modality is right for us, right? Because we're also bio-individually unique. So what works for you isn't necessarily going to work for me, and vice versa. So we run a lot of these N of 1 experiments, but we do it from a position where we're very informed and educated. And so that's the discipline here. We don't just act on hearsay, but we do our own research, and we biohack so that we could be our #1 resource for happiness and safety, and to take control of our own health. But to do that effectively, we need the best and the brightest teachers around. And that's why we put on this show, for you, for us, for all of humanity. And here to introduce our esteemed speakers tonight is our newly appointed co-host of Biohack the World Miami, Jonathan Hippensteel. You might know him as the son of Dr. David Hippensteel, former speaker at Biohack the World, but also widely regarded as the fittest man over 60 after winning at the CrossFit Games 3 years in a row from 2016 to 2018. He's an incredibly inspiring individual, but his son is no less inspiring in my eyes. His name is Jonathan Hippensteel. He's an international male model and a lifestyle health coach, and now co-producer of Biohack the World. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage, Mr. Jonathan Hippensteel.
Thank you so much, David. Welcome, everybody. How are you guys doing? It's great to be with you all tonight. Thank you again to Sacred Space Miami for providing this platform for us to connect around these topics of biohacking. As I've been reading Brainwash and getting to know the Perlmutters, who we'll be introducing tonight, I believe that what they are teaching is crucial to us to understand and apply now more than ever, given this pandemic. As you'll hear from them, technology and digital media are literally rewiring our brains, and much of the time for the worse. But now, to stay connected with many of our normal communities, we must rely on this same tech and digital media in our new normal of physical distancing and safer at home culture. Tonight, you'll become more aware of the effect that technology is having on us, and then we're going to learn strategies that can help us thrive individually and collectively, both now and for the rest of our lives. Nature, nutrition, fitness, mindfulness, real human connection. These seem obvious, but what's been missing are the strategies that provide the bridge between the information and action. And that's what we're going to get tonight. We're thrilled to have the Perlmutters with us tonight, and I personally love their father-son dynamic. I've gotten to collaborate on some cool projects with my dad, though none as monumental as writing a book. So I'm sure it was awesome for them to write Brainwash together. Dr. David Perlmutter, he's a neurologist and 5-time New York Times bestselling author. He lectures all over the world on the connections between our brain, our diet, and the microbiome. And his books have been published in over 30 languages. His son, Dr. Austin Perlmutter, is an internal medicine physician, also a New York Times bestselling author. His focus is on helping people improve their lives through better decision-making, which definitely shines through in Brainwash. He also writes for Psychology Today, as well as several other publications. And so, my fellow biohacking brothers and sisters, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Drs. David and Austin Perlmutter.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Perlmutter, and Austin, I see that you're here.
I am here as well.
Great. So I guess why don't we just get started in our presentation, and then we'll take it from there. You all set?
Let's do it.
Here we go.
Okay. Let's get going. So let's just talk about the obvious thing here. Here we are across the country, potentially across the world, getting together for this conversation. And one of the core things that my father and I have been focusing on over the last 2 years is how do we drive interpersonal connection? How do we strengthen the bonds between people? Because this turns out to be essential for not just our mental health, but also our physical health. That this is related to better outcomes as it relates to diseases, heart disease, even having better immunity. And we always said it's better to be in person when possible. At the moment, this isn't possible. But what we're doing is really the absolute best we can with what is available. And I'm so thrilled to have this chance to connect with all of you, albeit remote, but to communicate this information, to answer your questions, and to continue to engage in the types of bonds, interpersonal bonds, that we know are essential to our well-being. As you are all well aware, we're in an interesting moment. These are stories that you may have seen. These are graphs and numbers that you're likely aware of. We're in an odd, strange time where the coronavirus is occupying the majority of the waking hours for many of us. Now, whether that's actually being in the hospital looking after patients with coronavirus, just worrying about getting it ourselves, worrying about the financial repercussions of this, or trying to deal with this new reality, which is, what does it look like when we wake up in our homes and we're not able to go to our jobs and do the things and spend the time with the people we used to? So certainly there are many aspects of this current moment which are unique. But as we look at this, I think it's relevant to consider this quote from this Greek philosopher Epictetus. He said, "We cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them." And I think this is incredibly relevant right now because there is so much uncertainty. Now, you guys are biohackers. I know you're keeping up with the latest studies. Maybe there's a treatment that works, maybe there isn't, but we're really just not sure yet. We don't have the data. We don't know how big the peak is going to be, whether we're going to flatten the curve. We hope that these things will happen. But, on an individual level, I wake up and I'm not sure about where I'm going to be in a month from now as far as what my day-to-day is going to look like. And I imagine that many of you share that same uncertainty. So with that said, we need to be considering what we can do, which is within our control. And what is it we can be working on right now? And again, these strange and really unprecedented times. So we can be working on our mental health. We know that when people are isolated, mental health tends to suffer, but we also know there are things that we can be doing to offset that. And these are things that are very simple. We'll be talking about them throughout this presentation. We also know we can be working on our physical health. Just because we're home doesn't mean we have to stop exercising or even just moving. And maybe most important is that we can work on how we think and we can work on how we act. We can focus on how to make better decisions. We can decide which of these doors we want to walk through as it relates to how we emotionally respond to other people, as it relates to how we deal with the stressors of this day. So I hope you'll agree with this point. And this point is that our decisions are critical. They're essential if we want to reach the outcomes that we care about. If you want to be a healthier person, if you want to be a happier person, if you want to have better relationships, if you want a better job, then you need to be making the right decisions. Now, again, we're in a strange moment. And while it's tempting to think about how we can do everything right now with the available data, it's perhaps more helpful when considering how we make decisions to look back at how we make our choices in general. So before everything got a little bit strange. I think it's valuable to consider these three major areas in which we make decisions in most days, I would say. So considering what it's like in America right now, how are we making our decisions when it comes to our diet? If you think about the fact that 70+% of Americans are overweight and obese, and that the principal cause of obesity is the food we eat, not necessarily the exercise we get, but the food we eat, and that we know that there are foods that are strongly associated with gaining weight. For example, refined carbohydrates. The example I'd like to give here is donuts. All of us know at this point that donuts are not healthy. I don't think there's anybody getting on TV and saying, actually, donuts are the key to longevity. It activates or dampens mTOR, it turns out. We all have an awareness that these things are not good for us, and yet we continue to engage in these unhealthy behaviors as it relates to the food we eat. We continue to eat overprocessed food. We continue to eat foods with added sugar. We continue to eat these vegetable oils that sometimes we are aware of, but we're still consuming because they're what's easy. Now, what about as it relates to exercise? We know that in America, the recommendations for American adults are to get 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise each week, a little bit less if it's vigorous. And so that means 5 days a week, we need to be doing 30 minutes of exercise. And yet, unsurprisingly, perhaps to all of you, less than 1/4 of Americans are getting the recommended amount of exercise. Again, we know that exercise is good for us. There's no one getting up on TV saying exercise less and spend more time sitting in your chair, but we still don't make that decision. And I think especially relevant to this moment and in general is the question of financial decisions, because these are decisions we make that can actually have short-term outcomes as well as significant long-term outcomes that are either in our favor or significantly causing detriment in our lives. We know that 80% of Americans are in debt. And we know that we're spending an enormous amount of our finances on these quick fix, instant gratification things that we find on websites like Amazon that we don't really need. So what I would argue here is that as it relates to some of these biggest decisions in our lives, these are things that we're not doing well, that in general, we're not making a whole lot of great choices. So this is going to become relevant, again, as I mentioned, as it pertains to the present moment. The problem that we talk about in our book and in general when we do these lectures is that we know what we want to be doing, but we just can't get ourselves to follow through. Case in point, you wake up in the morning, you set your alarm, it's 6 a.m., you're supposed to go for a 2-mile jog, but you wake up and you just decide not to. Or you decide you're going to start a new diet, and so January 1st comes, you start eating less carbohydrates. Everything's going well. It's not that 3 or 4 days in, you now realize the science was off and it turns out that refined carbohydrates are healthy. You know they're bad for you. But despite that knowledge, you fall off the diet train. And this is what happens to so many people. So the point is that there is this breakdown between information and action. We know what we need to do. We can't put that information into action. And likely all of you have a bookcase with at least several books that have been written on how to improve your health, how to improve your mental well-being, how to improve your thinking. But if you're not putting that into action, you just wasted your money. I'm sorry to say that. But the only thing that actually matters is if you're following through on this knowledge, if you're putting it into action. The unfortunate part to all of this, and it's something that we see very often in clinical care, is that when we don't follow through on what we're supposed to be doing, what we believe we want to be doing, we blame ourselves. So we say that it's our fault, we just didn't care enough. So the question here is, what might we be missing in this process? Is there something more to this? So again, you make good choices. That's what we want. All of us want to be making good choices. The reason being, good choices lead us to good health. You eat healthy food, you're going to be a healthier person. You exercise, you're going to be a healthier person. You stop smoking, you're going to be a healthier person. And these are the things that enable us to have an optimal life. We have looked at this in a very straightforward model. We say that good choices are predicated on 2 factors. Factor 1, information. Do we have the necessary information? And the other piece is willpower. So again, if you know that you shouldn't be drinking Coke, and you go out and you have a bottle of Coke, then the reason that you did that a lot of people believe, is that you just didn't have the willpower. But what we're trying to do here is expand this model a little bit, because a deficit of willpower translates into blame. So the question that we are trying to ask is, what is it that comes before all of this? And it's very straightforward. The concept is that the way that your brain is set up is going to determine how you make your choices, and that is going to lead to your outcomes. So this is the big idea. We are the architects of our future brains. We have the ability to start choosing the way that we are going to live our lives in the future by designing our brains today. And our future brains, the brains that we wake up with tomorrow, the brains we wake up with in a week, are going to determine the choices we make and whether we wind up healthy and whether we wind up happy. So that's all well and good. And as a concept, I hope that resonates with you, because I think it's so key that you get outside of this blame model and appreciate that decisions are a function of your brain wiring. But unless we can put this into action, even this isn't that valuable. So what we're going to be doing in this presentation tonight is we're going to hit 3 key topics. First, we're going to go over these certain regions of the brain that have specific functions. We're going to talk about how these parts of the brain are changed by, are manipulated by, many times intentionally, by the modern world. And then we're going to teach you how you can take back the wiring of your brain for your own benefit, such that you start making good decisions, and it makes it much more likely that you reach the outcomes that you care about. So as promised, we're going to talk about some key parts of the decision-making engine. The brain, again, your decision-making engine. Now, I want to be clear on something. The brain is incredibly complicated, and I do not claim to understand every part of it. As it relates to decision making, there are several fields of science that have converged into what's called neuroeconomics. It is very dense, but it's very interesting. What we want to talk about tonight, though, is the most valuable information for you to know such that you can start wiring your brain for good decisions. And as it relates to that, we want to focus on two regions of the brain. So the first region of the brain we're going to talk about is called the prefrontal cortex. You are probably aware of this part of the brain. It's been highly publicized in multiple books. There are many things that the prefrontal cortex does for us. What we want to focus on again is what's most relevant to the question at hand, which is how do you improve your decision making? And as it pertains to this, the key functions of the prefrontal cortex, it enables us to plan complex behavior. So if you want to plan to do something tomorrow and it's going to take multiple steps, that's the prefrontal cortex coming online. It enables us to suppress socially unacceptable urges. What does that mean? The example I like to give is if somebody cuts you off in your car, and I'm down in Miami, so that's basically every time you get on the road, you're going to have this desire, perhaps, to speed up and cut that guy off. And maybe if you're really intense, you're going to want to knock on that guy's door and demand an apology. The prefrontal cortex enables you to say, that's not a good plan. Let me take a step back and see if this is really a big deal. And ideally, just get back to driving safely. It's key in enabling us to understand the difference between good and bad. And if there's any part of this that I think is worth remembering, it's that it enables us to see good and bad choices. So in any aspect of your life, you want to have this on board when you're making more complex decisions. It enables us to plan for the future. It enables us, I should pause here for a second. So it enables us to plan for the future. What an important kind of human-specific ability to cogitate on these specific aspects of being able to plan for tomorrow, the next day, and what is most optimal in that trajectory. But the next two pieces of this, I think, are largely missed by a lot of the books that discuss this and perhaps a lot of the lectures you've heard on the subject. Now, empathy in general is a complex subject as well. It involves multiple parts of the brain. It involves the insula, for example. It involves the amygdala, and it also, though, involves the prefrontal cortex. But what's most unique about the prefrontal cortex and empathy is it enables us to engage in what's called cognitive empathy. That means that we are capable of putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes. If there's anything that is necessary to get into a strong and lasting relationship with somebody, it's that you've got to be able to see things from their point of view. And then finally, compassion. The prefrontal cortex gives us the ability to act with empathy. That's what compassion is all about. It's the ability to act in a way that is looking after somebody else. The other part of the brain that we're going to talk about is called the amygdala. Again, you've probably heard of this part of the brain. It's commonly referred to as the fear center of the brain. Sometimes it's called an emotional hub. It also, like the prefrontal cortex, has a lot of different functions. It's necessary for our survival. But again, as it relates to the decision-making process and improving the quality of your thinking, we want to talk about the fact that the amygdala is a key hub for emotional reactivity. The fight or flight response. When you get stressed and you get concerned when that person cuts you off in traffic and you consider for a moment, or maybe don't even consider, you just floor it and try to cut them off, that is the amygdala saying, we're upset, we're going to take care of this. Which is why it makes sense then to say that the amygdala is always activated in aggression. So thinking of aggressive behavior as well as acting it out. The amygdala also, because of these things, tends to be involved with more impulsive behavior. If the prefrontal cortex is weighing the pros and cons, the amygdala is saying, we're just doing this right now, it has to happen. And finally, it's involved in tribalism. So this sense of us versus them, which is so damaging in this modern world where, again, we're all kind of in this together. I want to emphasize again that it's not that the amygdala is bad and the prefrontal cortex is good. In fact, these both parts of the brain are essential for us to be able to function at a high level. What you need is to have a balance between these two parts of the brain. You need for them to be in communication such that those emotional responses shoot from the amygdala up to the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is able to integrate that into a decision and then say, okay, here's the plan, amygdala, calm down, it's actually not the end of the world, and then send that message back to the amygdala. What happens, and what seems to happen a lot in the modern day, is that the balance is off. Why does that matter so much? It's because the prefrontal cortex, with compassion, long-term planning, and good health, and connection to other people, falls victim to an overactive amygdala. And instead of being compassionate, and instead of planning for the future, we're reactive. We have poor health as a result, and we are disconnected from our health, from our general mental state, and from other people because of this. So we develop this in the book, and we call this disconnection syndrome. The reason for that is because, again, we are disconnected from our health when we're making poor decisions. We're disconnecting from other people when we're not engaging in cognitive empathy and compassion. We're also disconnecting from the planet when we're not able to make decisions that look at the bigger picture, as, for example, it relates to climate. So I want to kind of pose a question for all of you, because the takeaway to all of this is that your brain is being constantly changed by your experience in life. This is neuroplasticity, a term you're likely very familiar with. We get to decide if we want to harness that power, if we want to wire our brains for good decisions. But if we do nothing, if we enable the modern world to do with our brains what it will, we will allow them to be wired for poor choices. So it's a pretty hard split that we need to decide what side we're falling on. Let's talk about some more specific aspects of the modern world that are damaging to our brain. What is it about modern life that activates the amygdala to a pathological level? One of those is sleep deficit. It turns out that even one night of not getting enough sleep leads to a substantial increase in amygdala activation when we face a threat. It's actually 60% higher activation of the amygdala when volunteers are deprived of sleep for just one night. Another factor here, and I mean, let's be honest, you're never going to hear a lecturer talking about how great chronic stress is for anything, but as it relates to this specific subject, it turns out that chronic stress literally changes the neural wiring of your brain such that it causes neurons in the amygdala to expand. It causes the dendrites to reach out and make new connections. It causes there to be a stronger connection within the amygdala and a weaker connection to the prefrontal cortex. What does this mean in the modern world? Well, when you think about the fact that the average American adult, before all of this coronavirus started, is spending about 2 hours a day on social media, and when you consider that for the average American adult, around 80% of the time, they are reaching for their smartphone in the first 15 minutes after they wake up. And they're also using their smartphones right before they go to sleep. Smartphones induce stress. Smartphones also put off blue light, which keeps us from getting enough sleep. So you can see how an overuse of social media, both through the stress aspect as well as the disruption in sleep patterns, is going to lead to an activation of the amygdala. You also see how the tribalism piece of this can be quite easily activated when you go into a social media funnel that puts you into a specific room for people who only share one opinion. And then the news. I think that, of anything that is relevant from this talk that it pertains to what life is like right now, you got to think about the news. It has seemed the status quo that all of us have to watch the news, or at least pay attention to the news, for every waking moment of the day in order to, quote, be informed. But if we're honest with ourselves, it's not as though we are getting informed when we're watching that much news. We're hearing the same sound bites over and over again. And for the most part, what we're doing is actually damaging our mental health at the expense of general other things that we could be doing as well, like exercising or spending time with people we care about, even calling them. So the news and the news and social media are really key things that we need to think about as overactivating the amygdala. I wanted to mention this study. It's something that we presented recently at a talk because the researchers who did this did such a great job in explaining this mechanism. How is it that an upregulation in the amygdala could lead to actual problems? What we don't want is for the amygdala to be too active, and as I've said, when we don't get enough sleep, that seems to activate the amygdala. So what does that mean as far as our decision making? In this trial, they looked at what happens to people when they don't get a normal night of sleep, and then how much would they value snack rewards versus non-food rewards. So basically they said, would you prefer to get something like a candy bar or a hat? They're both the same value, and they saw if people got enough sleep and they didn't get any sleep, what they had happen. Right. What they found is that when people were sleep deprived, they preferentially went for the candy bar. It changed the way that they perceived the world such that it modified their decisions to eat the junk food. What they said in this study is that this paralleled the increased activity of the amygdala. If that wasn't bad enough, there are multiple other studies that show, as I mentioned, that the amygdala is overactivated when you don't get enough sleep, and that then translates. Because what happens when you don't get enough sleep? You're going to eat junk foods. You're going to eat too much food. So when you don't get enough sleep, when you skip sleep or are restricted in sleep, that translates to, on average, 385 kilocalories a day that people will eat more when they don't get that sleep. And in case you're thinking, okay, maybe they burn it off because their metabolic rate goes up or they exercise more, they actually looked at that. It doesn't happen. So not getting enough sleep increases amygdala activation, and it makes your decisions worse. So, of course, the other piece of this, the balance, is that when the amygdala is overactivated, the worst thing that could happen is the prefrontal cortex is underactivated because the prefrontal cortex needs to calm down the amygdala. That's its big role in this. What is it that leads to underactivation of the prefrontal cortex? Well, we mentioned sleep. And you kind of know this already. What happens when you're sleep deprived and you're trying to drive in a car or pay attention on a test? Your attention isn't there. You can't focus. Focus is a function of the prefrontal cortex. So it's a really easy way to know that your decisions are going to be compromised. Chronic stress. I mentioned this before, but it's literally the worst possible situation. While the neurons in the amygdala, in at least mice models, expand and the dendrites make more connections, what you find is in the prefrontal cortex, those neurons shrivel up and die. So you get a double hit here, and you can see why being exposed to chronic stress over time is associated in the research with more impulsive decision making. The other piece that's worth considering here, and this is actually very recent data, which we'll talk about in a moment, is that inflammation itself appears to shut down the ability of the prefrontal cortex. And by that, I mean, when you look at people who have higher levels of inflammation in their blood, they actually tend to make more impulsive decisions, which to me means their prefrontal cortex is not capable of allowing them to weigh the pros and cons of their choices. So what does this mean when translated into aspects of the modern world? Well, again, sleep deprivation. We know that Americans on average are not getting enough sleep. About 1/3 of Americans are not getting the required amount of sleep. I should say actually suffer from insomnia. But in general, we know that Americans are not getting the 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night that are recommended. Chronic stress. Mentioned it before, but right now in this present moment, we know that already most Americans experience chronic stress. I guarantee you that with unemployment, what it's turning into, and with everyone so worried about this virus, levels of chronic stress have gone up throughout the world. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I just want to note that it is important we understand chronic stress isn't just something that is lowering your daily quality of life as it relates to your mental health. It is actually changing your brain function. And that still doesn't sound all that great until you realize there are things we can do to both improve the function of our brain, to offset that stress problem, and to lower stress through things that we can be doing at home. Last part of this, of course, is inflammation. And again, you guys are aware of this. The average American or the standard American diet is filled with junk. So 68% of the foods that are found in American grocery stores, foods and drinks, in one study of 1.2 million food and drinks, contains added sugars. Added sugar induces inflammation in the body, right? It glycates our proteins. These things cause inflammation. It causes hardening of our arteries. It leads to a host of other problems, in addition to fostering insulin resistance, which is also associated with inflammation, in addition to fostering the creation of visceral adiposity. Turns out that those fat cells also create inflammation, in addition to damaging our microbiome, which also creates inflammation. So as it pertains to inflammation, the key takeaway that I would say is the best way to moderate that, or to mitigate, I should say, the effects of inflammation, is to choose your foods wisely. However, there are other things you can do as well. For example, a moderate amount of exercise has been also shown to lower inflammation. Okay, so that's all the doom and gloom piece of this. Things are bad. The modern world sets us up for poor choices, whether it's through social media becoming intentionally addictive, or our foods becoming intentionally addictive and activating those reward centers so we keep making those choices, thereby damaging our decision making and getting stuck in a circuit of making poor choices, or not getting enough sleep, which again disables the prefrontal cortex. What we want is a solution to this problem. And if the problem is disconnection, then of course the solution is we reconnect. How do we do that? On a physical level, what we're talking about is reconnecting to the prefrontal cortex, and really reconnecting the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala so that they're able to have communication. How do we preferentially activate the prefrontal cortex? These are things that you guys have heard about before, but maybe haven't heard the specific research about how this works. So nature exposure, exercise, an anti-inflammatory diet, and meditation. These are all things that we can be doing in order to, again, preferentially activate the prefrontal cortex. And what we see is, with these activities, you can see changes in activation patterns in the prefrontal cortex and in decision-making itself. We're going to go into some of this research. It's absolutely fascinating. But know that you can induce structural changes in your brain if you engage in these activities. So this isn't just you feel a little better. There are physical changes in both the wiring and connection patterns that are happening within your brain when you do these things. This is perhaps one of the most interesting and readily available pieces of research. Readily available, I mean, you can apply this today, that we found with doing the research for this book. So this paper is appropriately named The Nature of Impulsivity, and you'll see that's a pun in a second. And its visual exposure to natural environments decreases impulsive decision-making in a delay discounting task. That is a somewhat complicated title. Let's distill that down into something a little bit more relevant. What they're trying to figure out here is what happens to decision-making when we are exposed to nature. What they did in this paper is they found graduate students who are always in need of doing these studies, and they asked them a question about whether they wanted money now versus money in a little while. And they changed the amount of money and the time or delay until they would get that money. So at a very basic level, what they said is you can have a little bit of money now, in this case, let's say $10, or you can have a lot of money, $100, at a later point in time. And that might be a month, it might be 2 months, a year, it might be 10 minutes. What's really interesting about this is a technique that's been used in economics. And what they're trying to find is, where is the point where somebody is willing to say, I need the short term as opposed to waiting for the long term? So these are, again, the things they were looking for. But right before they asked them this, whether they would take more money later versus less money now, they gave them exposure to 10 seconds of some photos. These were a set of three different sets of photos. So there was a natural environment. You can see a nice shot of Multnomah Falls from Oregon. A built environment, which I'm not exactly sure what city that is, but I think many of you can relate with these pictures. And then a geometric environment. And this is kind of designed as more of the control condition. So again, they just showed them these pictures for 10 seconds, and then they had them answer this question, which is, would you like smaller money now versus more money later? And this is the way that they look at this. This is kind of challenging. I'm going to walk you through it, so it's going to be very simple. Where this arrow starts, you can see that if a person is basically asked, would you like $10 now or $100 in, let's say, 10 minutes? Basically, everybody is willing to wait. So what you see up here is that people are all willing to wait that 10 minutes. But as time goes on, you can see that people are less willing to wait. So as time goes on here, and you look at these graphs, and you look at these graphs, you can see that the red and blue arrows are going to drop off quicker. What does that mean? It means that people who looked at the geometric or built environments, looked at pictures of cities, were not willing to wait as long as the green line when people looked at pictures of nature. So what they said in this study is that exposure to natural environments may decrease impulsive decision-making in humans. And I want to take a moment here, because certainly it's one small study, just over 100 people or so. But if there's a possibility that 10 seconds of looking at a photograph of nature improves the quality of our decisions so that we're no longer as focused on instant gratification, on the quick fix, and we can instead think about the long-term ramifications of our decisions, that is a powerful little tool. Because we all, if you're here in this meeting tonight, have access to those photos, right? You can take that a step further. You can look at a YouTube video of nature, which is better because it's moving. Or you can go all out and get a plant for your home. We may not have access to some beautiful natural hike right now, and that's okay. The goal is to use what we have available. So there are a lot of ways we can do this, and it's impressive that even 10 seconds of a digital picture of nature is sufficient to induce some of these positive changes. Now, what they said in this paper, which I think is worth considering here for a minute, I'll just kind of distill it down, is that when we make better decisions, these better decisions are going to benefit both nature and ourselves. So thinking about, let's say, climate change, if we're willing to look at the long-term repercussions of our actions, we might be willing to perhaps not pollute as much. And so that's something that actually helps nature as well as ourselves. So it's kind of an interesting thing that nature induces this change in our decision-making, and that may actually help nature itself. Let's move to another piece here, which is the meditation and mindfulness part. You guys have heard that there are all sorts of studies, I'm sure, about mindfulness, about meditation. And to be clear, we're talking here about mindful attention to breath in this study, at least. I would say that mindfulness is a general paying attention to what's going on inside, what's going on outside. Meditation is a more formal practice that includes multiple modalities of achieving more calmness. But in general, people say mindfulness is a type of meditation. We'll just go with that. Why this study was pulled out, why we chose this study to present, is because this was just paying attention to your breath. And what it's showing is that, well, we'll get to the results in a second, but what they tried to look at is there any change in brain function with just paying attention to your breath? And specifically, is there a change in that also important connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala that we need in order to make good decisions? So in this study, they had 26 healthy people. They taught them how to pay attention to their breath and do this mindfulness, paying attention to your breath meditation. And after just 2 weeks, they did brain imaging of these people with a functional fMRI, an fMRI, which is a functional MRI, which looks at activation in the brain, while they were showing them aversive pictures. So that might be looking, at a picture of somebody pointing a gun at you, stuff that's designed to incite an emotional response when they were meditating and when they were not meditating. So what they found here is that meditation increased prefrontal cortex activity. That's the goal. That's what we're trying to get out of this. And as you may know, when they look at meditators who have meditated for years and years, decades, they actually show increased activity and even increased neural structure in the prefrontal cortex. In this study, however, after those 2 weeks, they showed increased integration, increased communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And then finally, they showed reduced activation of the amygdala. So what they're saying here is that for 2 weeks, doing, I think it was about 20 or so minutes a day of paying attention to your breath is sufficient to cause these observable changes in the brain, which are really the things that we're trying to highlight for better decision-making. It's powerful stuff, especially because, again, we're all at home. Well, Many of us are at home right now, and you may not be able to get to your local meditation center, but if you can pay attention to your breath for a few minutes a day, that could be a powerful intervention for improving your quality of life, yes, but also decision making. I wanted to bring in a little bit of a larger study. This is a meta-analysis of MRI studies where they actually looked at 110 different studies, so several thousand people, and they wanted to see what are the changes, the structural perhaps changes in the brain that we see when people meditate more. What they found here, again, relates to what we just discussed. Meditation induces functional and structural brain modifications, especially in areas involved with self-regulation, as well as areas involved with attention and executive functions. So what are the areas of the brain that are involved with self-regulation and attention and executive functions? That is the prefrontal cortex. So as I alluded to earlier, you see structural changes in the prefrontal cortex with people who meditate more. Now, we're not going to spend too long on exercise because I'm sure you guys have heard a whole lot about why exercise is important. But notable here, this is looking specifically at what happens in cognitive function for older people when they exercise. This is a meta-analysis again, so it's pooling a bunch of different studies, in this case, 18 different studies. In this case, the people were older, so 55 to 80-year-olds who were mostly sedentary. And what they found in this study is that people who engaged with fitness training were found to have robust but selective benefits for cognition, with the largest induced benefits occurring for executive control processes. So again, exercise is going to increase our ability to make good choices by activating the prefrontal cortex. There are actually several different methods, or I should say, several different mechanisms that researchers have tied to this, and they're actually quite diverse and quite impressive. But for example, when you exercise, you are increasing blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, which is thought to help it both have more oxygen so that it can function at a higher level, and also to remove the waste so that it's capable of cleaning itself up. What you also see, though, and maybe the most important part of this whole thing, is that when humans exercise, or when exercise occurs in general, but when humans exercise, they measure that they have higher levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. Now, why does that matter so much? It's because that enables us to engage in neuroplastic changes. It enables us to solidify and grow new connections with our neurons. So if you're already exercising and you're already activating that prefrontal cortex, that is going to enable you to make good decisions, and now you're going to throw on some BDNF, which is going to solidify those connections, that is going to be a double benefit for you in enabling you to have, again, better health, but also better decision-making, a better structured brain. I'd also say there are many things, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A at the end. I'm sure my dad has lots to say on this, but there are many things that increase BDNF, exercise being one of them. Now, why is that so key to all this? Well, we want these interventions to stick. When we are engaging in a new habit, something that we know is healthy, for example, meditating for 10 minutes a day, or for example, eating healthy food, or for example, going to bed at 10 o'clock as opposed to 12:30 at night, we want to do everything we can to lay down those pathways and solidify them and glue them into place. And so that's why getting this BDNF on board is so key, because that is cementing. It's helping, I should say, first of all, it's helping things to be a little bit more plastic so that you can make new connections, but then it's helping to cement in these new neural pathways such that you continue to engage in these healthier behaviors. So this is kind of, a graphic that applies to all of the different things that we've been talking about tonight. But the idea is, when you do one of these powerful brain-helping activities, like getting enough sleep, or eating healthier, or exercising, or engaging in meditation, or spending time in nature, that is going to improve the quality of your decision-making. And when you make better decisions, you will then be more likely to want to continue to do those things that are healthy. This is kind of the opposite of the way the modern world sets up our day-to-day function, because in general, we are eating junk food, we're not getting enough sleep, we're exposed to chronic stress. When we do those things, we're activating the amygdala, we're deactivating the prefrontal cortex. And so we're going to then be more likely to continue to do those things and continue to make poor decisions. So we get stuck in this vicious cycle where, let's say you're eating junk food, that junk food engages your reward circuit, takes your prefrontal cortex offline by increasing levels of inflammation in your bloodstream. When that happens, you're going to be more likely to continue making those poor decisions of buying that junk food. So the goal has to be moving from that vicious cycle to this far more productive and helpful cycle where we're actively improving the quality of our brains such that we can continue to actively improve the quality of our brains. And Isaac Newton said, a body in motion tends to remain in motion. That's really what we're talking about here. Our goal is to get started on this path such that we can continue to do these things we know are so important. This is the translation of the information into action. It starts with getting that activation in the part of your brain that will enable you to continue to act in the way that is best for you. So let's pull all this together and tie this into the present moment. We've talked about how we need to connect to this part of our brain, how we need to connect to better decisions, how we need to connect to better health. But it's clear in all of this that we also need to be reconnecting to ourselves. We need to be reconnecting with other people. There's some interesting research that's come out from Cigna over the last few years as it relates to loneliness in America. And it turns out that, unfortunately, rates of loneliness, people who would consider themselves lonely, some or all of the time, have only been going up in the last few years. In fact, they found that over 50% of Americans would now say that they feel lonely some or all of the time. So how can we be surrounded by billions of people and yet feel so lonely? The point is that we need to reconnect with other people in a way that is more tangible. We don't necessarily want to be spending all of our time on social media. It's not necessarily the time, however, to be going over to our good friend's house, especially if that good friend is 85 years old with multiple comorbidities. So this is the time to be connecting with other people, but we have to be careful about how we do it. I think that this modality, what we're doing right now, is perhaps the most powerful way for us to engage with others because it brings in the video piece, it brings in the conversation piece, and there's something just a whole lot more robust about engaging with people when video is involved. So when possible, I'm recommending to everybody, you do what you can to schedule some time to talk to other people. That video chat is best perhaps, but if you can get with them on the phone, if you can chat with them via messaging, any of these things are wonderful ways to connect with other people. And then the planet as a whole. So we mentioned nature being an essential tool in enabling us to make good decisions. But as it relates to empathy, this is such a fundamental role, this cognitive empathy and this compassion that comes from the prefrontal cortex. It's absolutely fascinating to see that people who spend more time in nature have higher levels of empathy for nature, as well as higher levels of empathy for other people. So by connecting with the planet, we're actually connecting with other people. Also turns out that the more time people spend in nature, the better their mental health, the better their physical health. So by engaging with nature, when we reconnect with nature, we are also going to be reconnecting with our own health. And then again, how do we do these things? We leverage empathy, mindfulness, interpersonal connection, and community. And I would say here we are in this odd moment. We're doing the best we can in order to connect with other people. But, there are still a lot of people who are sitting there on their own and wondering what happens next. I would say that I haven't figured all of this out at all. I'm still trying to figure out each day and the latest information and integrate that. But, now is the time to reach out to other people who are probably struggling just as much as you, if not more. And we have the opportunity to even just listen, which is perhaps sufficient, but we also have this information from this talk that you can tell them, look, a lot of this is outside of your control. And maybe you're not going to be able to exercise, spend time in nature, and eat the healthiest foods today, but maybe you can pick some of that so that you're doing what you can to improve your mental health and your physical health during these challenging times. All right, with that, I'm going to pause this presentation and we will go out of the screen share.
All right. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Am I on here? Austin, can you hear me? Okay, great. Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and I can't wait to get to the Q&A. So we had some really interesting questions come up to the chat, and particularly, let me just start with the exercise one because that's always on my mind. So Noel Galperin asks, exercise or movement, are they interchangeable here, or is true exercise required? And then Carl Theodore also follows up and says, good question, Tai Chi, Qigong, breathwork, what do you think of those as exercise?
Well, from, one of the things that Austin talked about that I think is really fundamental tonight, and that is that what we're talking about here is rewiring the brain, and that is technically known as neuroplasticity. That's the ability of brain wiring to change based upon experience. And we want to enhance that potential as best we can. And exercise that raises the heart rate is seemingly the best type of exercise for neuroplasticity, the ability then to take advantage of this rewiring of the brain that Austin so eloquently described. So I'd say we're really looking at aerobics. Having said that, however, we have seen new data that has demonstrated that there is significant increase in something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the tonic for the brain, if you will, that not only is fundamental for neuroplasticity, but also stimulates what is called neurogenesis induced by yoga. So, there aren't a robust number of studies related to Tai Chi or other disciplines. So I think any movement with conscious awareness, being in the moment with respect to that movement, will be helpful. But I think there are a host of gene pathways that are activated specifically by the stress of an aerobic program and or resistance program that are really valuable. But that's a great question.
Yeah. And then how do you feel about high intensity training? Because, there are those studies that show that high intensity interval training can confer the greatest BDNF growth. So how does that compare? Can we?
Yeah, so that, high intensity interval training has certainly become popular. And Rhonda Patrick, as a matter of fact, in her podcast has recently talked about, I guess you heard it. There is some evidence that is a good way to enhance BDNF production. So again, I think it's really about getting the heart rate up. Is it a sustained elevation of heart rate to a level of, really, in a very gross way, 180 minus your age, and keeping it sustained at that rate for 20 minutes, or more of a burst type of activity as you'd get with high intensity training? Hard to say. Much of the research has really just been with people engaging in a, quote, aerobic program, not looking at heart rate, not looking at max VO2 and all those parameters. It'd be really great if we could look at that. We know, for example, even the stress of sauna upregulates BDNF production and might be the reason that sauna use is associated with decreased risk for dementia of all causes, as well as coronary heart disease as well.
Mm-hmm. And there was another question that just came in about HIIT training for older people. And I know that, CrossFit has a whole movement of senior citizens doing CrossFit, and it's all infinitely scalable, right? That sport. So
I'm smiling because been there, done that.
Okay,
as a senior
great.
Citizen, I might add. But I think that we have to recognize, if that question came in from a senior, as am I, that when we're in a room full of younger people who are in better shape, we have to tone it down and realize that we can't be as competitive as maybe some of us are used to being, but recognize, especially in these times, how incredibly important it is to double down, as Austin would say, on these efforts, on the meditation, on exercise, on the diet for sure. So many people think, everything's going to hell in a handbasket and I'm just going to eat whatever I want because it's comfort food. Well, it's about the worst thing right now we could be doing for all the reasons that Austin described, because especially it's going to lock us into the amygdala. It's going to increase our stress, which will increase inflammation, increase gut permeability, and that is a surefire way to downregulate the effectiveness of your first line of defense, your immune system. Mm-hmm. So everything that we all listen to tonight is so relevant not just for brain wiring, but for immunity as well.
Right.
Can I just add to that a little bit?
Sure.
So yes, I agree, Dad, with everything you said as far as the specific benefits from the BDNF studies. And if that is what you're trying to do with aerobic training, then that's wonderful. But I think to try to tailor this to where people may be at right now, and certainly the crowd of people in this room are people who are already looking after themselves probably, and maybe have still been able to get up in the morning at 6 a.m. and accomplish a 10-mile run and an hour-long gym session. But for many of us, that is no longer reality. We're looking at what we can do in our apartments sometimes. And even if that's not you, if you're trying to make recommendations for friends and family who are getting stir crazy and who aren't in the best shape to start with, I think it's so key to talk about movement, that if you are moving at all, that is so much better than the alternative. Because we know that as it relates to mental health, movement, exercise, moving around is associated with lower rates of depression. And I think that one of the big things that we've seen from situations that are similar to this, quarantine situations, and looking at those data sets and looking at what's already happening with coronavirus, is that the first major hit that many people are having is not to their physical health, it's to their mental health. And so it's one thing to talk about optimizing your physical function, right? Becoming an elite CrossFit athlete. That's great. But right now, we should also be thinking about what are the evidence-based methods of diminishing the mental health repercussions of coronavirus. And to that, I would say just movement, whether that's yoga or stretching or walking down the street with your dog or engaging in some really silly dance video on YouTube. It's all about just not sitting there ruminating over what you can't change. So I highly recommend, maybe it's not for you guys, maybe you're all doing your standard routines, but if you're talking to friends and family, just any movement that is enjoyable is going to be far more sustainable than trying to adapt your 2-hour standard workout to an 800 square foot house with 4 other people living in it.
Right.
And Austin, I think it really segues very nicely with a question that was texted to everyone from Fit by, I guess it's Romeo. It says, if I'm not taking care of any of these aspects right now, nutrition, sleep, stress management, exercise, where would you recommend me to start? And I will admit that is a question that Austin and I receive all the time. And, certainly it can be individualized, but I think strangely enough, we've both agreed that the one most powerful thing, at least across the largest number of people, seems to be get a good night's sleep. Right. And it is so difficult these days for people to get that good night's sleep because, the last thing people do before they go to sleep at night, and the first thing in the morning is to check the statistics, right? How many people this and that. And it's time, it's good to keep informed, but once dinner happens, you don't need to engage it. It's going to be there in the morning. Let that go. Do not have screen time. Read some fiction and get a good night's sleep. That's the most powerful way to A, amp your immune system, but B, to give you the ability moving forward to make better decisions as they relate to the other parts of the program, the diet and the exercise and nature exposure, the gratitude journal, etc. So sleep is a real big thing, especially these days.
And to try to make that point as practical as possible, understanding that a lot of us have had our sleep schedules thrown off by things that we can't change. If you have all of your kids home now or whatever else is going on, trying to work from home, it may not be that you're able to get in bed at 9 o'clock and then get that standard afternoon nap. So I think important to try to figure out where you can develop your new sleep schedule, because the most important thing you can do is develop consistency with it. Your body goes through this natural circadian rhythm. And if you're waking up at some point random and going to sleep at some point random, it's not going to know what's going on. So you want to really do your best to time your melatonin secretion and to time your body's natural buildup of adenosine such that you get in bed and get the most restful sleep possible. That may not be exactly as it was when you were out working in the world. It may not be that you go to sleep at 11. It may be that you go to sleep at 8 o'clock. But find that new routine that works for you. And then, as my dad said, really important to do your best not to engage with real big stressors right before bed, because what you want to have happen as you go to sleep is you want your cortisol levels to drop. That's what's supposed to happen. On the average person, your cortisol levels go down to the lowest point at around midnight. And then they come up into the morning and you wake up, you have energy, you have glucose, all these things are wonderful. But if you're constantly spiking your cortisol with news or even conversations, actually, my partner and I have been talking about this recently because I like to talk about world events right before bed. She doesn't like that at all. And it actually makes a lot of sense. You don't want to be doing that to yourself. What you want to do is give your body the absolute best opportunity to be slowing down such that you can get the restful sleep, such that then the next day, you're going to be less emotionally reactive. A lot of us are spending a lot of time in close proximity with our partners, with our family, with our friends. You don't want to be yelling at them and going off on them because they didn't wash the bowl yesterday morning, whatever it is. You need that sleep-derived emotional reactivity to be as low as possible. And, to make it as technical as you want, it turns out that REM sleep, which we tend to get more of in the second half of the night, is what is best for decreasing that emotional reactivity. So the key here is don't set your alarm super early if you're going to be cutting out, your usual 2 hours of morning sleep, because that's going to be what is most enriching to enabling you to calm down your emotions and engage with other people in a more loving way.
So don't go to bed angry, right? So
work it
out.
I feel like I've heard that before.
Yeah, that's a common adage. Okay, so we have some other questions. John, did you want to jump in here with a question?
Yep. While we're on the sleep, I'm glad you brought that up. That was actually one of the main things I wanted to ask you guys about. But there was one other sleep question from Noah Pushor. Where do you believe melatonin fit into all this? So if you want to tackle that, and then with this whole sleep discussion, there's so many ideas around sleep, like having a dark room, wearing blue light blocking glasses, quietness. What's the low hanging fruit, or what you want to hit on the most to maximize your night's sleep? Obviously not going to bed angry, but then talk about melatonin and other sleep supplements, if that fits into all this at all.
Go ahead, Austin. I'll let you handle that one.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned before, the goal is to get into a sleep routine, and I'm not going to be able to say this is the single thing that matters most to you, because that might be different. It might be for some people that they can watch TV until the last minute before they go to sleep and still fall asleep. Now, I'd argue their sleep quality probably isn't as good as it would be, but for other people, that's going to keep them up for several hours. And that could be both because of the stress of the TV and because we know that blue light, when it comes from an e-reader in one study, but when you're watching your TV or if you're looking at your computer screen without turning on night mode, is going to suppress melatonin. And you need that melatonin to tell your body, hey, we're getting started with the whole sleep process. So maybe for some people, it's, again, not watching the media right before bed. For other people, it might be something different. So I recommend experimenting with a calming down routine before bed. That might mean 10 minutes of meditation. That might mean getting in a shower. Turns out that when you get into a hot shower, you are going to vasodilate your extremities, and that actually shunts blood away from the core and towards the extremities, and then you lose some heat. So it's a weird thing where even if you're in the hot shower, you're actually going to cool off a little afterwards. Why does that matter? Because people sleep better when their body temperature drops. So that's another thing that you can do. Consider showering, or also you can consider dropping the temperature in your room by a few degrees and seeing if that works for you. We actually have a sound machine. I found that if there's a lot of background noise, that tends to be an easy enough hack that enables you to get into that feel where, okay, the sound machine is on, now I'm going to slip into sleep. But, it's really it's a lot more than just the hour or so before sleep, because it's all a circadian rhythm, right? When you wake up first thing in the morning, what you actually want is to be getting blue light and getting more light exposure to wake you up and to tell your brain, now we're going to be active. So ideally, in the several hours before bed, you would have a gradual decrease in the amount of blue light that your body was taking in through your eyes so that your body would be primed for sleep. So I guess that's not a very explicit single thing that you can do in order to get better sleep. But I do recommend to people you mess with a couple of these things and you could try them all at once to start with, and you'll find that there are probably a couple of those that work really well for you.
Is it okay or not okay to be taking melatonin every night, like exogenous, because that's so. I feel like if I take it for a couple of weeks in a stretch, I get bad nightmares, and
it does mess with your dreams, right?
Yeah.
So my perspective on this, and it might differ from my dad's a bit, is that you don't want to use melatonin as a sleep aid unless you're trying to reset your natural rhythm. It works really well if you're trying to go from one time zone to another, or if things have just been crazy in your life and you're trying to, again, get set into a routine of, let's say, being in bed by 9 and going to sleep by 10, then maybe it would make sense. But I think that people kind of get stuck in this trap of believing that melatonin is a helpful sleep aid that they should just take every night to be engaging in restful sleep. And I think pretty consistently in the literature, they've shown that taking supplements, or I should say, taking prescription medication for sleep for long periods of time is associated with a lot of side effects. And even taking a supplement of something like melatonin, you don't want your body to be dependent on that exogenous chemical in order to feel like you're ready to go to sleep. And I don't actually know the explicit research on this, but in general, when you give something exogenous to your body, it is going to change because it's going to factor that in. And the last thing you want is for your body no longer to be able to do it on your own and be dependent on this chemical.
Right. Well, how about the low dose? I have something from Whole Foods. It's Herbatonin, 0.3 milligrams of plant-based melatonin, and it says that you can take it every night. Should I trust it? Should I not?
I mean, maybe you could take it every night. It's a question of what benefit are you getting then, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to hack my sleep, and I have these trackers and these wearables, and I'm trying to maximize my deep sleep and REM sleep. But by the way, not all these trackers are giving me the same measurements. So like one saying my Fitbit's saying that I'm getting great REM, and my Oura Ring is saying my REM's in the shitter. So I don't know which one to believe necessarily, but I'm always trying to improve. So whatever I can do to improve it is what I'm doing.
For sure.
I do have a question about the night mode on your phone, or, do you think that that's effective enough, or should we be wearing blue light blockers? What do you do at night?
Dad, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. I think that by and large, the night modes on the screens are pretty good. We're doing this right now, and it's nighttime. Yeah. So having said that, we should theoretically all be wearing amber glasses at this point. We don't do a lot of these types of things at night, but it used to be we would do them at night because people would be home from work, but I guess we could do them at any time. I think amber glasses are a really good idea, especially if there's a show you want to watch in the early evening. I know my wife is a big proponent of that. I think that the shift to night mode on computer screens works actually very well. I think the worst thing for me right now is the fact that I have studio lights in here, and I know there's blue light contained therein. So, that may be something to think about. But I like what I see on computer screens in terms of night mode.
Great, cool. And on that note about circadian rhythm, right? So, intermittent fasting, time-restricted feeding. There are those studies that show that intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding could be more effective if you're following the circadian rhythm. So eating with the cycle of the sun, how do you feel about that? I know that I personally don't have that schedule because I tend to sit a lot at my computer when I wake up, and I'd like to do fasted exercise around noon. So I don't eat until 4 p.m. Is that okay? I'm doing a 4 to around 9 p.m. I know that's not ideal for sleep and circadian rhythm.
When we talk about what is ideal, it's really nice to talk about the broad stroke recommendations for people in general, but we really do need to recognize that people are different, and trial and error, people will respond. I mean, Dr. Sachin Panda makes it very clear how we can identify, perhaps, based on other characteristics, what a person may respond to. But the idea of eating to correspond to the height of the sun really goes back to Ayurvedic medicine, and that the fire of digestion peaks with the fire of the heavens. So the peak digestion in Ayurvedic medicine was around 12 or 1 o'clock in the day as the sun was peaking out. And interestingly enough, in Ayurvedic medicine, pitta, or fire, peaks again 12 hours later in the middle of the night when you're sleeping, which is when you are now deeply involved in dreaming. And actually at that point in night, you're actually involved in deep sleep, activating your lymphatic system. So you're really, at that point, cleaning things out. So I think that to, again, specifically answer your questions, you know what seems to work best for you. I like to hear that you're not eating till later in the afternoon. That's a real easy hack for people. Just get busy in the morning, do your meditation, do your exercise, answer your emails, and then before you know it, it's time to eat. You've had a really nice, some people say, well, I don't have breakfast. Well, everybody will break their fast ultimately, right? So everybody ultimately has break fast, whether it's at 6 p.m. or 2 p.m. So, but I like what I hear because it is in a way a bit of a time restriction. And how much autophagy are you activating in that short period of time restriction? Unclear. But it is a bit of a stress for your body that does impart some positive activation of certain gene pathways that we know are ultimately good. We call that hormesis. So I think what you're doing sounds really good.
Oh, thank you. And I have found that I have not actually gained any unwanted weight during this shelter at home order. So I'm moving a lot less. I'm getting a lot less steps in, but I'm also, I'm doing my at home body weight exercises. And with the time restricted feeding, I'm finding that it's working to not add any unwanted weight. So I'm pretty happy about that.
Well, that idea about maybe you're not moving as much as you used to, I think that for one thing I would recommend people consider doing, it's a little bit off topic, but I'm going to go there anyway. That is, if you have any yard or if you have a balcony and could put a pot of dirt out there, plant some vegetables, buy some vegetable seeds and plant some lettuce or kale, because we're going to be doing this for months. Face it. And it doesn't take that long to grow up some lettuce or some kale. For me, it's tomatoes and eggplant. My goodness, those good old nightshade vegetables. But the point is, you're reconnected with nature. You are moving around. You're in the moment, and you're planning for the future. I mean, it's what we've been talking about all evening.
Right. Okay, and so you bring up a very good point, something that I've been thinking about a lot, and that's how to grow my own food in the event of a major economic catastrophe, right? This is a real possibility here. I'm not going to try to beat around the bush. I think there's like a 5 to 10% chance of a total global, economic collapse. So what can we do? Because our prefrontal cortex is the one that allows us to forward plan, right? To think, okay,
right. It's exactly what we've been talking about, planning for the future.
Yeah, and what could happen, right? With coming up with all the various disaster scenarios and how are we going to be able to deal with them? So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, putting seeds in the dirt is, I don't know if there's any science behind this, but I would tell you, in my opinion, that is a rock solid prefrontal cortex activity. Why? Because you are planning for weeks to months in the future. Impulsive activity is buying the Doritos off the shelf in your 15 minutes that you're allowed in the grocery store. So I think this is, as I mentioned before, a great activity to allow you to enhance your connection to the prefrontal cortex and at the same time secure some food for the future. You'd be surprised what you can grow in a couple of pots on the balcony. I tore up our backyard. Who needs grass at this point? And I've got lettuce coming up and eggplant and string beans popped up 2 days ago. I can't wait. That's going to be really exciting. So it really is about forward thinking, and what a great way to reconnect with nature and become more active.
And reconnect with the microbial universe too, right? Because you're getting your hands in the soil.
I come in and my wife screams because my feet are dirty. What a great thing. It brings up an interesting topic, and that is this hygiene hypothesis, whereby the immune systems of our modern culture, Western cultures, are not as responsive or robust because we live such a hygienically sterilized life environment. In contrast to areas around the globe right now, where they have very low rates of COVID spread, like Haiti and sub-Saharan Africa, they're exposed to parasites and helminths and are less hygienically involved. It's called the hygiene hypothesis. Dr. Strachan talked about it in 1988. And now we're seeing some real evidence that, what we've done to our gut bacteria may be enhancing inflammation, that enhances our responsiveness from the amygdala making us more impulsive.
Fascinating. That leads me into, Austin, did you want to say something?
I just want to make one point, which is that the world has been set up in a way that we've been able to rely on instant gratification for a long time. We don't see the consequences of eating poor or having poor food choices, of having maybe poor relationships, of making bad financial decisions, because things have been so good. And now all of a sudden there is a transition. And now all of a sudden we can't get away with being really impulsive anymore. And if we do, it's at the expense of other people, right? So if you went out and bought all the toilet paper, now other people won't have toilet paper. And that's like kind of a funny thing because, they'll have to figure that out. But it's the same with all of this. We've got to be thinking about the future. It's the only way that these types of things develop solutions. And I guess we have an opportunity here. We can decide to continue on and just basically distract ourselves with our devices, which I think is going to be the default for a lot of people. Or we can do what we can to plan for the future, to develop ourselves. And I want to tell everyone, I'm still struggling with this, right? I wake up and if I'm home, then it's not like I'm productive every moment of that day. There are some great fishing videos on YouTube. But we have this opportunity, this global thing that has been put in front of us that is really challenging, but it presents us with a chance to reframe the way that we want to approach our decisions. And it becomes such that the only way to be really successful in this diverse and rapidly changing environment is to be looking into the future a little bit, because planning for the moment doesn't work with major existential threats. So I just think it is from a philosophical perspective, it's a really interesting dynamic that plays into our relative balance of how we make choices.
Fascinating. I love that you're into philosophy. And John, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to get back to, I love that hygiene hypothesis. I'm going to definitely read up more on that. Thanks for sharing that, Dr. Perlmutter. But I wanted to get up to the top. Beth had asked, this is a little specific, but I want to get to her. She was diagnosed and then treated for Graves, and she feels like that taught her certain behaviors and reactions. So you're saying that she can rewire this, even though it was chemically based in thyroid overreacting. So maybe talk about that, and then maybe other people that have specific pre-existing conditions and how just these tips and strategies might change for that, or if they would change.
Well, I don't think any specific rewiring of the brain is part of Graves' disease. But interestingly, there is a bit of a segue here that we can explore, and that is, Graves' disease is become very, very common, especially in women, and it is an immune issue. And we wonder why it's becoming so much more common. Obviously, we haven't changed genetically, but we're certainly changing in terms of how we influence our gene expression, leading to thyroid issues, leading to other types of thyroid issues like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune condition. And so I think that it does get back to some of the influences of our modern society in terms of our immune system, and really takes us back to what is very fundamental in our conversation this evening as it relates to our lifestyle choices affecting our immunity, affecting inflammation, affecting the wiring of our brains, and really gets right back to the notion of the gut bacteria, and therefore relates to our food choices. So we wonder why we see so much thyroid disease, especially in women, why we see so much autoimmunity, again, especially in women, and why there is this interesting push right now to try to leverage drugs like Plaquenil and hydroxychloroquine that are used for autoimmune conditions, oddly enough, now for as an intervention as it relates to COVID-19. So I think I gave you a very broad answer, but I tried to somehow segue that back to Graves' disease.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I would just say, again, I don't want to be too specific to this condition because I don't know how helpful that is, but it's interesting to think about the fact that the hormones in our bloodstreams changes our thoughts. So whether that's thyroid hormone or cortisol or insulin or epinephrine or norepinephrine, these chemicals, they change the way that our brain functions, right? If you think about how the brain functions, it's neurotransmitters. So the norepinephrine that might increase your blood pressure if it was out in your bloodstream, in your brain can signal certain chemical reactions. So all of these different things, whether it's Graves' disease or diabetes, the bloodstream molecules behave differently in the brain. And it's kind of hard to parse that apart. You might have high levels of thyroid hormone in your bloodstream. Does that necessarily change the way that the brain is set up? I mean, it probably does something, but it's really hard to be able to say that here's how the wiring changes. What is most empowering, though, when you consider all of these things, is that we know that we can modulate levels of certain hormones by our decisions. We know that we can change, let's say, our insulin resistance levels. We know that we can change the levels of cortisol in our body. We know we can change levels of oxytocin, which, by the way, is seen in some studies to connect the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So it's these chemical messengers which are changing the way that we perceive the world, but based on the way we perceive and behave in the world, we're able to change those messengers such that we then set up our brains for better thinking. Again, not super specific to Graves, but it is part of this bigger discussion of you can modulate some hormones, and that is going to change your thinking.
Cool. Yeah, there's probably some very important clues there. I do want to touch a little bit on the asymptomatic COVID patients. Where I'm reading a lot these days that they're like 1 in 4 people are carriers or have COVID but show absolutely no symptoms. And I think in Iceland, 50% of the people are showing no symptoms. So do you have any theories about, because I'm not reading any information about all these asymptomatic people. Like, what is making them asymptomatic? Are they eating a certain diet? Are they exercising a certain way? Are they a certain age? Do you know anything about that? Or do you have any theories about why some people are asymptomatic to COVID-19?
Well, let me answer that, if I may. And so, this isn't, with all due respect, it's not news. We've known this since early March. The original study came out of Singapore indicating that about 40% of people were asymptomatic and yet testing positive. And then a study out of China indicated that number was closer to 62%, which is really worrisome. We did not see that with SARS. We did not see that with MERS. And we rarely see it actually with common influenza as well. And it's an issue not only of asymptomatic carriers who can transmit the disease, but in addition, people who are pre-symptomatic who will go on to develop symptoms, but nonetheless are shedding virus and infective prior to being symptomatic. Now think about that let's just say half the people are able to transmit this virus before they have any symptoms whatsoever, including any elevation of their temperature. Think about that in the context of early on, how people were being screened and how they are still being screened coming off of airplanes and off of cruise ships by simply having their temperature taken. And you have a normal temperature, you're free, you're screened, you're good to go. Well, the reality is we missed 50% of carriers, transmitters, potential transmitters with that mentality. So it does call to question or the importance of being dynamic. And now that we know this information, now that science has revealed this information, we need to act on it. And then the way that we act on that is by screening large numbers of people, by having ability to do so, by having testing. For people who are symptom-free but may have had a contact, may have had a person in the family or been out with somebody and now they're testing positive. The more we can do that, the more we can implement isolation, and the more we're then able to reduce the spread and, i.e., flatten the curve, allowing hospital resources to remain available for those who really need to use those resources. Now, why does it happen? It's unclear. It does appear that there are some determinants in terms of how symptoms will manifest. And it looks as if symptoms seem to manifest in individuals who, number one, are obese, and number two, may have other chronic conditions, that they tend to be far more likely to manifest symptoms. But interestingly, today a report came out from Italy that demonstrated the difference between severe versus mild disease in terms of symptoms pretty much would be as you would expect, that those individuals who are going to go on and demonstrate severe disease would have more likelihood of certain symptoms like higher fever, et cetera, all except for headache. Headache, interestingly, was far more common in the individuals who ultimately developed mild disease, i.e. not requiring hospitalization. So why it is, I think, is unclear. We know that there are some genetic determinants that are called human lymphocyte antigen predispositions for having a worse outcome, what we call HLA determinants, which are now actually being targeted in terms of developing a therapy well beyond utilizing anti-malarial drugs, antibiotics, and antivirals. So it opens the door to understanding what is this uniqueness genetically in terms of HLA, and then B, how can that be manipulated in other individuals who are not that specific genetic manifestation.
So this is also something that I've been thinking about. These people who are completely asymptomatic, or just, would they, because their immune system is not launching a response to it or trying to fight it off, do they end up being long-term carriers?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because we do know that individuals who, during the course of their treatment, have received corticosteroids, which do damp the immune system. And the reason that has been used and is now, I believe, talked about in terms of not doing it, is to prevent what has been called the cytokine storm, this incredibly acute inflammatory event that typically occurs at around day 10. But the issue then is, if we dampen the immune response, might that then allow compromise our ability to fight the virus in the first place? So it's a bit of a tightrope that people are walking. I mean, having said that, however, it's very interesting to watch the evolution of the literature that relates to another class of anti-inflammatory drugs called the non-steroid anti-inflammatories. There's an awful lot of discussion right now about this idea that taking these NSAIDs is associated with a worse outcome. That is French literature that was fairly compelling, although a recent study that appeared in BMJ indicated that that is not valid. But when you recognize how damaging these non-steroidal anti-inflammatories are, like ibuprofen, to the gut bacteria, which regulates our immune response, there could well be some at least mechanistic understanding as to why that observation may have legs.
Great, thank you. John, did you want to jump in with a question?
Sure. I mean, one I just thought of, I'm fascinated by this microbiome and just this hygiene idea in this age, and especially in America where we are now, and especially now we're sanitizing everything, we're staying super sterile. What are some things, be that diet, be that more connection with nature, that we can do to build up our microbiome, make it more robust, and thereby increase our immune system's effectiveness?
Well, I have to tell you a funny story, because I was contacted by a national news organization because they had found a video of me from a couple of years ago saying, hey, don't be using the hand sanitizer at the end cap in every aisle in the grocery store. And they thought here was some wacko guy that's telling people in our current situation not to use hand sanitizer. Right. I got the guy on the phone. He wanted to interview me. I said, look, you're taking this out of context. That was a time when we were talking about our over indulgence in sterility, and that was a different time. So let's not do this interview. And he got it. But I think that the things that we know with respect to nurturing our gut bacteria, and it really gets back to something that, Austin, you were saying earlier in terms of, so many influences on our brains, including hormonal, and not to mention, which I now will mention, of course, when people say not to mention, then they mention it, neurotransmitters and the role of gut bacteria in facilitating the production of things like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine. So in a very real sense, our gut bacteria influence our thinking and our moods. Yeah. But to John, to answer the question, I would say that catering to our gut bacteria is very much in our interest. Eating good fiber-rich foods to nurture them, prebiotic fiber, especially garlic, onions, leeks, jicama, which is Mexican yam, Jerusalem artichoke, broccoli, cauliflower. All these foods are rich in what is called prebiotic fiber. It's the type of fiber that is used by our gut bacteria for them to replicate and for them to do their job, which is to shore up the lining of the gut so we don't have leaky gut. And that has a huge role to play in balancing our immune systems. And also at the same time, making sure that we're not challenging our gut bacteria by unnecessary medications like the NSAIDs or acid blocking drugs or unnecessary usage of antibiotics, especially these days.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and speaking about drugs, we have a question from Carol who asked about Ativan. She was prescribed Ativan 0.5 milligrams of melatonin. So her doctor suggested, or she's trying to switch from Ativan to melatonin after her breast cancer surgery. And she's wondering how to transition because Ativan affects the brain and causes Alzheimer's. Do you have any information about that?
I'm going to say that I can't comment on prescription medications like that. I think it's definitely something to talk about with the doctor. Ativan's a strong medication, as I'm sure you're aware. And, transitioning to melatonin is probably something you want to talk about because there can be withdrawal effects and similar issues. So talk to the healthcare professional. Yeah. Unless, of course, Dad, you want to take that one.
No, I would agree with you. I mean, this is something she should talk to her prescribing physician about. Ativan long-term can be very difficult to just turn off. And we would not be in a position, either Austin nor myself, to make a recommendation to go to something that is non-prescription from a prescription medication. That should be handled by the healthcare practitioner.
Cool. Going back to nutrition a little bit, because I know you're the expert on that, and I've read all your books. But I've been recently kind of going into the rabbit hole with the carnivore diet and understanding or learning about that argument. Do you have any response to the idea that it would be a great way to go on the carnivore diet to rectify any autoimmune issues? Because that's like the ultimate elimination diet is what they're saying.
I think it's ill-advised. I mean, what have we talked about tonight extensively? We've talked about the idea that our gut bacteria play a pivotal role in modulating our immune system. We know that one of the strong correlates that we see with autoimmunity are fairly dramatic changes in the diversity of organisms in the gut. That said, going on a diet that virtually eliminates dietary fiber, which is what we desperately need for our gut bacteria, in my opinion, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Are people losing weight on a diet that is basically focused on meat and other animal products? Sure they are. But I think in the long run, it's not something that I think makes for good health.
I'll chime in one little note on that. We so badly want to believe that we're going to discover the diet, right? The one that fixes all of our problems, that after thousands of years of experimentation, all of a sudden we realize all you have to do is eat animals and your issues go away. And, I think this is just a great moment to look back at human history and how dietary trends come and go so frequently and look at the big macro, pun intended, I guess, but themes that have been consistently shown in the literature. And I think it's really hard to go through the literature and say that plants haven't been good for us, right? Like plants give us so many phytochemicals that are essential to proper function. And yeah, you can supplement your way if you decide you're going to eat only meat products. But what we're talking about when we're describing dietary modification, or at least what I'm talking about, is how do you not go on a diet for a couple of weeks, unless you're doing that for a medical intervention, but instead find a lifestyle around eating healthy foods that you're going to be able to continue for the next several decades. And as it relates to that, I just don't see eating only meat products as a sustainable plan. So there's going to be probably some literature coming out. There's some stuff that references it, But looking at the body of literature that exists right now and comparing that to what does or does not exist for the carnivore diet, it's not really a comparison. We have so much good data saying that eating plants is good for us. And I just think it's, we want to do what we can to experiment, to iterate, to do keto or paleo or whatever we think is going to do best for our bodies. And certainly there is bio-individuality. So there may be people out there for whom the carnivore diet is ideal. That's absolutely not something I'm debating. But what I'm saying is when we make these macro statements that everyone should only be eating meat, it just doesn't speak to the literature, and it's not helpful to the majority of people who would just benefit from getting a little ways away from the standard American diet. I also see that as a problem because if you are conscious now that you're going to do the carnivore diet, that means you're conscious that you're going off of the standard American diet. And that in and of itself might be the intervention that helps you. Not the fact that you're eating only animal products, but that you've decided to stop eating all of this ultra processed refined carbohydrates and refined vegetable oils that we know is not good for us.
Yeah. I think the argument there would have been that they're not saying that everyone should be eating animal products for the rest of their life, but that it is a tool in our toolkit in the case of an autoimmune issue, or if we wanted to go on a 2-week elimination diet, because the phytonutrients and plants can actually, some people have greater sensitivities to them in their gut. And so it can actually cause bad reaction to some people. So, and then also
that Austin and I are in agreement based on what he just said, that, as an intervention, it might have value for some people. Dr. Gundry has sure talked about, these plant lectins is causing all kinds of problems. And as David, as you say, there's certain plant issues that people may have, like gluten being from a plant.
Yeah.
But I think in the long run, if we're trying to give our genome ultimately the signaling from our food that it has adapted to and been exposed to for hundreds of thousands of years, that would be giving the genome plant signals as well as, of course, catering to our microbiome. But, recognizing that we've always eaten things that we would either find or we would kill or are already dead.
Yeah.
And that certainly included plants.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I'm very omnivorous. I'll eat plants. I love plants. But when I do source my animal protein, I make sure that it's grass-fed, grass-finished, and sustainably raised, only had one bad day in their life. I think we can all understand or agree that commercial animal feeding operations need to be shut down, full stop. But so in terms of it being good for our planet and regenerative agriculture, definitely want to steer everyone towards eating only the highest quality animal protein.
Sure. A general rule of thumb that I recommend is to avoid eating the foods that people have messed with the most. You want to avoid ultra-processed food. And when an animal is eating grains that it's not used to eating, when it's been given antibiotics and hormones, that is an ultra-processed meal when you finally eat that steak. So it's not saying you can't eat animals. It's saying that you need to then be even more aware than you would have been with the plant, because now you have to worry about how the animal was raised and also how the stuff that the animal is eating was raised.
It's true. Absolutely. So I want to kind of shift a little bit towards philosophy. And you had that Epictetus quote, which I loved. And someone here had just posted something about America emphasizes rugged individualism versus truly relying on each other and trusting each other. We need a new connection paradigm, tribe consciousness. And that comment really spoke to me. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how you see America? How are Americans going to be able to survive and thrive after things start to get back to normal? I mean, it's not going to be the way we remembered it anymore. So I guess paint that picture for us.
Well, I don't think, I could be wrong. I'm relatively young, but I don't think things will ever get back to the same normal, right? I think this will be
100%.
Even if a cure comes out tomorrow, this will be somewhere in our shared collective consciousness for at least the rest of my life. And as I was talking about before, the fact that the instant gratification stuff just no longer works. I think, it's it's a whole lot of just tremendous uncertainty and stress and all this. And it's kind of a question of how do we adapt to it? And what happens when the stuff that we used to do to distract ourselves falls apart? I want to be clear that I'm not trying to downplay the gravity of this, that people are dying, that tons of people, billions of people are struggling across the world. But just, we know that to be true. So that's the starting point. And so then the question is, okay, and then what? What are we going to do to move forward? And there's the option one, which is I'm going to distract myself until I can go back to my... And then there's option two, which is I'm going to do something such that I become somebody who adapts to this changing environment. And I think that as it relates to the connection piece, we said this at the start of the lecture, if this COVID thing has done anything, it has shown us that it's not one country's here, another country's here, you're in your county, and we're over here on the west coast of the United States. We are all interconnected. We're all in this together. And that's literally what this whole social distancing thing is about. It's just a reflection of the fact that you can't take a piece out of the whole anymore. So I'm seeing that already there is tremendous outpouring of support for people across the world. There's sharing of resources across borders, both countries, counties, cities. And that's the way that we're going to solve this thing. If somebody does create an invention that's able to treat this, or a vaccination that's able to prevent it, we will need to share that with the planet. And it's the first time, again, in my life, that it's not this intense patriotic America is the best and the other people are suffering. Look at how we're doing as a country for this disease. Not great. So I'm not trying to say that in a way of being anti-American at all. What I'm saying is, it's not about saying we're the best country anymore. It's about saying we are a global community and we're all suffering from the same stuff. So why not just treat it that way and pull together a little bit? I was on a conference call the other night with people from across the world who are doing research in neuroscience. And I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we can see is important now, because all the barriers are artificial anyway. I mean, you thinking, okay, we shut down American borders, but no, you're in your own little house, right? And so we see that it was all kind of artificial in the first place. And now we have this opportunity to grow as a community, as we're doing tonight. My hope is that perseveres.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like it's reflective a little bit about that statistic, right? So the United States has the most expensive healthcare system, and it comes in last place of all developing countries in terms of its efficacy, right? So
I think we were called on our bluff is what happened. Yeah. We can talk a big game, but when it came to time to play, our team just hasn't been practicing. Yeah. And my sense is
that's really good.
At this point, we'll be able to acknowledge that and actually train for the next game.
And I'd like to say that isn't it interesting that much of the governmental decision-making on the front end of this was just thinking about, short-term, 2 weeks, whatever, we're going to leave everything open for now. There's really nothing going on, and we're going to and we'll go back to work and not to worry about it. And then, which is amygdala based, let's face it, it's impulsive, it's short-sighted, it's not really thinking beyond ourselves. But there's been a shift now saying, you know what, we need to take a step back and think about the long term. If we make these good decisions now, then we will be able to get back to work ultimately, though it will be painful in the short run. We will accept that for the long-term decision that we will make using, that wasn't said this way, but using our prefrontal cortex. We're going to bring the adult in the room and make decisions based on looking at the ultimate good in the long run, as opposed to what I want right now.
I did have another question about death and spiritual preparedness, and I don't know if this is something that you talk about, but how for all of us who have like death on our mind, and I the great Stoics also really thought about this quite a bit, and I feel like there's something to be said about Stoicism as our most powerful tool in approaching this this catastrophe and this crisis. But do you, what can you say to people who are maybe really fearful about dying? Is there any kind of advice that you can give? I know that's...
For me, at my age, it's certainly going to be a different perspective than what Austin will tell you. But I don't really embrace the notion of stoicism at all. Years ago, I began realizing that it's really important to be with the feeling. If it's fear, if it's a fear of death, to experience it. And I remember reading something Deepak Chopra had written long ago, and it was a response to somebody who wanted to quit smoking cigarettes. And his response was, don't quit, but just be with the cigarette. When you're going to smoke, don't be smoking on the phone or at the dinner table, whatever. Go outside, stop, and smoke the cigarette. Then you'll begin to embrace what it's all about. And I in these troubled times, I've taken that attitude that I'm just going to be with it in the moment, going to make good decisions. I'm well aware of what's going on around me, but to me, the notion of stoicism is sort of pushing ahead, pushing through, and I think for me as individually, what works better is to not try to push through, but to rather remain in the moment and be much more flexible and adaptable to the situation at hand. I mean, I've had some life challenges, and I recall how I responded when I had a life-threatening event, and it was just being in the moment, and it wasn't a place of fear at all. It was just a time of acting.
Did that spur you to become healthier and better after you recovered? Did you feel like you had a new lease on life? How did that feel when you recovered?
I'm not sure, with all due respect, that it did. I think that the current experience has far more, has done that to a much more significant degree than having had an issue landing me in the hospital acutely. This current event, because I think I understand the implications of it, as you mentioned earlier, as possible implications of it. And it's really provided me, and I know, Austin, you'll probably want to respond to this as well, but an amazing sense of really gratitude for everything around me, whether it's the cardinals and the blue jays that are visiting our bird feeder in the morning, or the bamboo trees in the yard, or just seeing my neighbors out walking more than before. There's a lot of good, Austin talked about it, there's a lot of good things happening right now in terms of reconnection. Though we socially distance, we don't need to socially isolate. And I'm watching that happen. So it's being in a place of being able to perceive that and then and relish that.
Great. We do have Austin. Did you want to jump in, or?
Do I want to get into a philosophical?
Sure.
Not a debate with my father. But I think that there is this question that comes from the amalgam of Stoicism, Buddhism, integrated mindfulness, which is, where does the drive to continue pushing forward come from when we're already at peace with things, right? And that's just it's a question that isn't, so it is explicitly answered in some of the interpretations of some older philosophy. And I think I'm not a scholar of philosophy, but what a lot of Stoic philosophers would say is that you still have the drive to do your absolute best every day, to help other people, to help yourself. You're just not going to get caught up on the things that you're incapable of changing, one of which may be death. I mean, you hear these stories of Seneca and other famous Stoic philosophers that just didn't care at the end and enabled themselves to experience these traumas. So yeah, I'm not going to be somebody who is advocating that you need to convert philosophies at this point, but I do think there is a real value in asking yourself, when it comes to the things that are causing you specifically mental health concern, right? Whether that's the existential threat of this disease that is deadly and could happen, and I could get it, I could die from it, or the question of what's going to happen now with financial insecurity with a job, or Will life ever go back to the way it was? We can sit and we can dwell with these questions. We can ruminate over them. They can spin in our heads, and that can keep us up at night. As we said, that's a problem. That can lower our quality of life, taking us away from paying attention to the birds or calling somebody else up. And I think that just objectively looking at it, unless you're doing something productive with that concern, let's say you're scared about dying, so you decide you're going to lower your chances of needing to go to the store, so you buy groceries for the week. That makes sense. But then once you're done with that, ideally, you stop. You stop worrying about the possibility of getting the virus and dying, and you go spend time with your friends and family. Now, there's going to be a different place there for everyone. Maybe you're somebody who wants to do a lot of research right now to develop, as you guys have wonderfully done on the Biohack webpage, a repository of all these great studies that you can learn from. It's maybe just interesting to learn that stuff, but we've got to do our best to recognize where we transition from something helpful to doing it because it's either a distraction or it is a way of putting off looking at our own mental state. So that's my opinion.
All right. I'm sticking to it.
Cool. We have time for just some, maybe one more closing question, but John, do you want to throw in a question here?
Well, I don't want to drag this whole philosophical discussion on, but talking about belief in a higher power, belief in God, does that play into all of this at all? David, I love what you said about Dr. Perlmutter about that idea of presentness, and the quote, Austin, that you started off with from Epictetus. It's like, let's focus on what we can control. There's so much we can't control. That idea of being in the present moment, the future is yet to come, the past is gone, being in the present, letting go of control. Did you guys look at kind of that, any like faith or belief in a higher power and how that plays into all this? I don't know if that's too general, but did you want to comment on that at all?
I can tell you that we didn't really touch upon that in Brainwash in the book. We did mention or discuss the how prayer and meditation work similarly in terms of the prefrontal cortex and calming the amygdala. But we specifically guided the book away from that area to be as inclusive as possible. We felt that what we're proposing in this book is important for everyone, for people who pray, for people who meditate with a mantra, for people who meditate doing some mindfulness practice. And we wanted to be as inclusive as we possibly could. Similarly, even our dietary recommendations, while we didn't go all in on plant-based, we did say, we think it's best, let's consider OMD, one meal a day being plant-based, so as not to, interestingly, so as not to alienate some. But it turns out when you do that, you're always going to alienate people. So, I recently learned that having interviewed this woman who wrote a book called OMD, One Meal a Day Plant-Based, Susie Cameron, and posted that interview, and the response from people in the carnivorous world was extremely negative. And the whole premise of the book is being able to experience, like Austin described, this cognitive empathy, the ability to take a deep breath and listen to other people's viewpoints, see the world through their eyes momentarily. Now, you may agree, but you may disagree, and that's what it's all about. And moving forward through our current situation, I believe, mandates that we do that. From a scientific perspective, that's for sure, that people are going to have ideas that may run counter to our beliefs from a scientific perspective, but nonetheless, they may have validity in terms of a treatment or vaccine. Similarly, we have to extend that cognitive empathy as people talk about their positions on a variety of topics. That's the big leap that we could make with this, that Austin alluded to in talking about how people are coming together.
Thank you.
Well, can I do 4 or 5 rapid fire questions? So
the lightning round.
Lightning round. So someone's asking about how is it still safe to eat vegetables because people are touching them? Is it?
What was the question? I'm sorry, David.
Is it safe to eat raw vegetables these days with no gloves on? Can we do that? shopping in the produce
I'll tell you what
section.
we've done, and Austin, I think, has probably done something similar. The main types of vegetables that we are bringing home from the grocery store are things that can be peeled, like cabbage and cucumbers, things that can be washed, like cucumbers, tomatoes. We did get organic spinach yesterday that we washed in soapy water. But I will tell you that tonight we actually ate our own kale salad that we picked from our backyard, which was super cool.
Cool.
You know, nobody really knows. We know that the virus remains transmissible for about at least 48 hours on cardboard, 72 hours on plastic, because plastic, more than cardboard, can hold moisture. It needs a moist environment. And, you know, leafy vegetables, when you get them, are moist. In fact, they spray them in the grocery store every day with that little sprayer, keeping them moist. If they are handled by somebody who just rubbed their face and sneezed or whatever, it's potentially an issue. The virus can be transmitted through the mouth, through the mucous membranes of the mouth, and through the gut. We know that these ACE2 binding sites are in the gastrointestinal system as well as in the lung. We're not getting a lot of guidance in this regard. And so I think, you know, we need to err on the side of caution. And I know, Austin, you have a routine that you're going through.
Yeah, well, I haven't grown any kale in my backyard, so that's kind of out for the moment.
Not yet.
Not yet. I could try eating what's out there, but I don't think it's edible. So just, I think to your point, Dad, again, we don't really know all of this data yet. We have this study that shows that when they did this controlled experiment, they could detect the virus for 72 hours on plastic, right? And it kind of dropped off depending on the media afterwards. So my goal is to assume that if there's something that is either metal or plastic, which tend to be the surfaces that hold on to the virus longest, that I am not touching that and then touching my face, my mouth, and therefore self-inoculating. Now, that might be aggressive. We just don't know right now. You know, up until a couple of weeks ago, we were being told that America wasn't going to get anyone with coronavirus. And now, look, we have not only more than everybody else, but by thousands more than every other country on earth. And so, again, to make it specific to the vegetable thing, my girlfriend and I have really been struggling with the greens, because it's one thing to buy root vegetables and allow them to sit for a couple of days before you touch them so that you know whatever virus is on there hopefully is dead, or wash them with soap. But for the greens specifically, what we've been doing is not the most eco-friendly thing, but getting greens that are in plastic and then transferring them. Because the idea being, if they are in a plastic bag, then even if the outside of the bag is contaminated, the greens inside are likely not. So what we try to do is wash the outside of the plastic container with soap and water. And then when we transfer the greens out, we ideally just dispose of the plastic container or recycle the plastic container. It's not ideal, right? We would much rather be doing what we usually do, which is getting the produce and putting it directly into reusable bags. But our grocery store no longer allows reusable bags in the store. And I think for a good reason, because again, we're worried about these surfaces that tend to hold on to the virus for longer periods of time. So to kind of close that loop, what I would say is assume that anything that's plastic could hold the virus for up to 3 days. And if you've waited outside the 3-day window, it's probably fine to be touching it and not worrying so much. Same thing if you want to be careful with mail, with packages, whatever else. When we get mail, we leave it outside for a couple of days because we just don't know yet. And it may be that a couple of weeks from now, the definitive study comes out saying that I'm being paranoid. I'm okay with that. One of the things that has been clear about this virus throughout is that we haven't erred on the side of caution. And I think now is the time, if you can, to do what you can to err on the side of caution and give yourself that opportunity not to inoculate yourself unnecessarily.
Cool.
Yeah,
Thanks.
you know, we've heard that, for example, Amazon packages, some Amazon workers have tested positive, but you say, well, the Amazon package took 3 or 4 days to get here. Well, yeah, it did, but it was just handled 15 minutes ago by the delivery person who put it on your front porch, who may have sneezed. So I think we have to think about that. And Austin said he doesn't bring the mail in. I think it's a great idea for packages as well. And then when you do open them up, they should be opened up outside. The contents come out, and then if they're in plastic, they can be sprayed with a bleach solution, or just put on the garage floor and leave them there for a few days as well.
Yeah,
the idea
we don't know yet. It's just a question of how do we do everything we can to optimize our health and not unnecessarily get infected.
And you know, you might say that I'm being germophobic, and I would 100% agree with that statement.
Okay, last rapid fire question, because we're a little over time here. From Kitty Carter, does medical cannabis taken at night affect sleep quality? Or how does it affect sleep quality, medical cannabis? Do you have an opinion on that?
I would say that most of the literature that's been demonstrated here is really mostly about CBD, not specifically medical cannabis, i.e. no THC involved. And I think there is some evidence that sleep may be enhanced with CBD. It's not very powerful in terms of the mechanisms whereby it works. I don't think there's a robust amount of data out there. I think that the THC component does tend to inhibit dream productivity and doing the consolidation of memory that happens during dream state. So again, I think when we see medical cannabis, I think it's really important to delineate between CBD and CBD plus THC.
Okay, cool. And that is it. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. It was an incredible time. I mean, you're my hero, so this is a really special occasion for me. Thank you so much again, Austin, David, John. Did you want to say any last words about or final thoughts about where people can get in touch with you? Or I know you're constantly pumping out videos, right? So how can people follow you?
You want to go first, Austin?
I'll go first. Mine's shorter. Let me say that I'm so thankful to you, David and John, and for Sacred Space, for, I guess, the entire team, for putting together this whole thing at a time when people, I know I really benefit from this connection, where it's much easier to self-isolate and just decide I'm just going to watch an entire season of whatever it might be, Tiger King or otherwise, online.
Saw it. Guilty. Saw it.
Yeah, we could do some more questions on what's going on there. But it's a rough time for everyone, and I want to make it as clear as possible that I am also having challenges around what do we do now? What do I do now? How do I manage my mental health in this? And I think that opportunities like this one enable us to continue to learn, but also just to connect with people who are interested in asking questions and learning about the world, whether that's about coronavirus or about the brain or anything else. And I am so grateful that you guys have put this together, that we got to share this and interface with all these wonderful questions that people have been asking. For reaching me, I have a Instagram account. It's at Austin Perlmutter. I have a Twitter account at Austin Perl MD. And then the best way to just get access to our content is brainwashbook.com.
Brainwashbook.com. All right.
Brainwashbook.
Right in the comments for everyone.
And for me, I guess it's Dr Perlmutter, drperlmutter.com be the best place. Facebook is David Perlmutter, MD. I do a live broadcast on Facebook every day at 5 p.m. Eastern. We did our 22nd coronavirus talk today, and hopefully I'll be doing it again tomorrow. So there you go. Thank you. And I reiterate what Austin said about being grateful for all you guys do to make this happen. Now it's our second time together, and I'm sure it won't be our last.
I hope not. Thank you. All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us for this incredible broadcast. We're so looking forward to seeing you at the next online event on Tuesday, April 7th with Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams and frontline OR Dr. John Seitz at Lenox Hill and Team Physiologic. We're going to be talking about New York City's response to the COVID crisis and how we could be better prepared for the next outbreak. So please check Facebook and Instagram for more details on that. And to all of you on the front lines of this disaster, our hearts and prayers go out to you. Yeah. We thank you so much for your service. What you're doing is so courageous and selfless, and we're so incredibly grateful for all your work. We wish you all the strength and fortitude that life has to offer. So Godspeed. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you, guys. Take care.